Guys, we're going to talk a little bit about jig fishing and the different types of jigs that I like to throw and the reason I like to throw them. Obviously, one that's come into play here the last few years has been very effective is the swimming jig. And people ask me, it says, Bill, is that basically the same thing as the half ounce you throw stuff? And it's quite the contrary. A swimming jig, this particular one is one that Travis Williams made, but if you'll notice the contour of the jig, the way the head's built, to where it swims through the grass, and that's what you're going to be looking for on your swim jigs. Versus a jig, this is being a half ounce, being a lot broader with the width and a little bit heavier. But these are the two jigs that normally I will end up throwing. But one of the questions I also get asked a lot is about the size hook, and then very important is a little mustache, as I call them, that they put on, and how I tweak them. Do I cut them? Do I spread them? And everybody's got their own variations of doing this. But over the years, I found out that by just tweaking, and what my rule of thumb is I like to take the jig at right here at the sharpest point on the hook and grab it about like this. What I want to do is turn the jig around, grip it to where it's going to be covered, but I do want to trim a little bit of it off. So what I do is trim it at a small angle, about a 45-degree angle that you notice, but always line it back up. One of the problems you have with jig fishing is, and the reason a lot of people don't like to fish jigs, you hang it up all the time. To help eliminate, there's a couple of things you can do. Number one is take the bristles and spread them evenly, just the way I'm showing here. I spread them out, and I like to take one drop of super glue, waterproof. As I spread them out, take one drop and put it right in the middle of that little old mustache there. And what that does, let it set, blow on it for a second or two and let it set up. What that does, obviously, causes a divide to where it protects the hook. If you notice here how the jig is protected now. The reason I do this, when you fish in brush, on a cold, bad day, when you get buried in the brush, this jig has a tendency to turn. And when it turns, what happens, it'll turn on its side, but it hits a limb or a tree, therefore protecting the barb of the hook there. Very important. Quite the contrary to the way I think about worm fishing is, I do have a worm here today that I'd like to illustrate a little technique that I use when the conditions are really, really bad and you're losing a lot of jigs. You can take a worm, take the fat part of the worm, just cut you a little piece of the worm off. And I use this quite often when I'm getting some real heavy brush. Take the little piece of the worm, insert it into the barb, as so. What that does, that obviously has a barrier when it gets into the brush pile, in the thick brush, that it keeps the barb of the hook getting into any part of the brush now. When the bass hits it and he comes down on it, it's just like he was worm fishing. He penetrates that, it slides up, you hook the fish. Very important to do this when you get in a lot of brush and you start to lose a lot of jigs. This is something that was taught to me by an excellent jig fisherman, and it works real well. A little piece of worm, always have a piece of worm in your boat with you. Let's talk a little bit about the tails. There's a lot of different varieties of tails out there for jig fishing. You know, it really don't matter, basically what you use, but you want sometimes something that's got a little bit of a crawl aspect to it, like a twin tail crawl here that I use. But what I do here, if it's a little bit too long, I just take a pair of scissors and cut a little bit of it off like that. And what it does, it gives you a lot more meat up in here to insert that into your jig. So what I do is I always look for the eyes on whatever I'm putting on there, and always put your eyes to the outside. It's just a superstitious type thing for me. But I insert this right down in the middle of the fattest part, and I thread it on. Bring it up, thread it, bring it all the way down. Take your glue, put one drop on there, blow it, let it set up for a minute, pull on it, that's about as good a jig that can swim through the brook, any kind of grass or along the shoreline and stuff like that. If they're hitting it short, then you reach down, pick up your chartreuse in the spring. And this is very important. You want to tap both sides, just a little on both sides. Something like that. And now, if she's hitting you short, I can just about assure you she'll get a mouthful of it when she comes back. There's something about the chartreuse on the back of any type of jig that enhances your bite twofold. That's the way I do a swim jig. Your basic jig, two colors I rely on extensively. There's a black and blue and a brown. Here I've got a jig. It's called a Big Salty. Big Salties are good for really big bites, to be honest with you. But I like to throw this a little bit more than the normal type. But I like to skip a jig. And people asked me one day, well, Bill, when you skip a jig, does it really make a difference of what side of the flat piece of pork or you throw in or piece of plastic you throw in that you insert the hook into? And it does make a difference. And let me tell you why. If you'll notice here on your tail, you got a big square part that drops off here. If you insert it from the top, coming down on top of it, what this does when you're skipping a jig under a pier, it hits the water and it causes the jig not to nearly go as far as it should under the pier. It's just a centrifugal force that hits it that causes it to do that. So what I do is turn that upside down, insert it, and if you'll notice, you can't see it now, but you got little old dots in there. What you want to do to go to your third dot on your jig, insert it down into there. And what that does, now you got a complete flat surface there. So when you skip that jig under there, there's no kickback on your jig sliding under there because everything's in a smooth fashion. When the bite's tough, always carry some rattles with you. As I talked a little bit earlier about rattling, sensitivity, noise, smell, it all comes into play on a jig bite. If you can't hear this, but I'm shaking it. It's got a rattle. Sounds just like a bait fish. So conditions are tough. You're not getting a lot of bites. Insert your rattle in there. And there's a lot of different ways you can do that. One way you can actually go by a jig and take your nail, insert your nail to the inside of the hook and penetrates there. Then you take that little weight and stick it right in there. Pull your nail out, take a little weight, insert it in there. But make sure you insert it to the inside of the barb of the hook. There, look here, then there you've got a tremendous force. As a matter of fact, this has got one. I'll show it to you. I didn't realize I started pulling on it. But I've got if you'll notice here, I'm getting ready to bring it out of there. I think I've got a toothpick in this one. A little toothpick that I broke the toothpick off. I inserted it into the side of it to the inside of the hook, so when she hits it and pulls on it, she's actually pulling on the toothpick. Therefore, you can use that particular tail, quite often by that. So here we go again. I'm gonna do this one more time. The toothpick's in. We're going to insert it, but I'm going to insert it to the back side of the toothpick, like that. And now I can pull on that thing, and she can pull on it. It's not going to come off. That's a good little tip that a guy showed me one day, but it works great. Another thing I'd like to demonstrate, when you fish the jig, say in a tree, it really has a tendency to get hung up a lot. So what you want to do is take your jig and keep a little bit of force on the line at all times. In other words, when you're pulling it up to drop it into a slot in a tree, you don't want to drop it on slack line. You want to keep some tension on your line at all times. What it does, when you pull it up off the tree limbs and stuff like that, it keeps that jig from sliding left and right. And it keeps you from getting hung up on the bottom of the lake. Very important. The other tail that I use, if that particular super chunk's not working, is that this particular, if you'll notice this hook here, that's a number 5. I hadn't trimmed it up nothing. But this being a twin tail, get these over to Bass Pro Shop. I thread these on there just like that. And when the bite's really tough and they want something that's got some vibration on it, always go to your little twin tails, and you get a lot of bites off that jig right there. Here again, just make sure you peg it, very important. One of the things you need to always remember when you're matching up, if you'll notice, always match the color of your tail with the dominant part of your skirt. For example, you see how dark this blue, and I've got some black mixed in there with it. That's the dominant colors on the jig. So you always want to match your tails based on the dominant color of the skirt on the jig. You'll notice here we've done the same thing. The dominant color is a green pumpkin, so we put a green pumpkin jig tail on the back of it. Over here we've got a little bit of a different color. We've got multicolors. We've got some blues. We've got some green. This particular tail here has been very, very effective on this particular color here. And I've used this quite often. Now, this is a clear water. One of the things you want to remember is basically the same thing as spinnerbait fishing. The darker the water, the darker the bait. The clearer the water, the clearer the bait. So, you know, you need to kind of understand the filaments of the water, how to read water, and therefore will enhance your bites. Because a lot of times it's non-productive to be throwing a clear type jig or something in stained water, because you're just not going to get the bites. It's that simple. They make a lot of different configurations of tails. Here you got a twin tail. It's got some extra little legs on it for more vibration. And then you got one here that I really like. Now this is a green pumpkin. And if you look at that, you don't see nothing really extraordinary about that. But if you look at it in the light, it's actually got purple in it. One of the things that I've learned over the years, and let me really exert this, anything that's got any sparkle in it, whether it's a star flash skirt for a spinnerbait or a jig tail that's got any elements of flash, there's something that will attract the bass to bite it. So you want to try to get something. Your crankbaits are the same way. If you've got a crankbait that's got some type of little flash or something that attracts that fish's eyesight, which is extraordinary, you'll get a lot more bites if you got color in your baits. Okay. You can contact Travis at 704-798-8251. He's actually showed me some of his samples as far as the different skirts that he can make, and he's probably got over 200-300 different varieties of skirts. So if you can imagine what colors you would like, and he's got them, he can build them for you. One other thing I'd like to mention about Travis, he's also designed clips, little places on the back side of his hooks, to where when you thread that bait up on the back of those jigs, it automatically hooks in to where it don't come down. But he's also developed a screw type to where you can take a plastic bait and screw it onto your jig heads. Here again, ensuring that you don't lose the bait. Does an excellent job.